I don't know about you, but for me, one of the most challenging things about digital raw photography is color. Color drives me crazy. Color, honestly, is the kind of thing that at times just makes me want to raise the white flag and say, forget it, I'm just going to shoot black and white, or put the digital camera away and just shoot film. And until that day comes when we can just, type into an input field in Lightroom what we want an image to look like, and then it color grades the image for us. That day is coming, right? Well, for now at least, the ball's in our court. So what I want to share with you in this video are some tips, some techniques, some recommendations, some of the tools that I would recommend exploring and experimenting with. Okay, so here we are in Adobe Lightroom Classic, and what we're going to do here is we're going to begin with just a few basic initial things that I recommend setting up at the beginning of your edit, and then we're going to eventually get into more advanced, more nuanced things as we go along. So the first thing that I recommend doing when you first sit down to edit a RAW file is to check and see what color profile is currently assigned to it. Now, if you are a relative newcomer to Adobe Lightroom or Camera Raw, if you open up this profile here, you will see that there are, a number of different Adobe branded options in here. These are all just general, basic, color profiles that are intentionally designed to provide consistent results with all the different, types of cameras that are out there, from Nikon to Fuji to Sony to Canon. And depending on the type of camera that you're using, Adobe Color may be perfectly fine. Like, it may look fine with your RAW files, but I know from personal experience that Canon RAW files, for whatever reason, just never seem to look all that good in Adobe Color or Adobe Standard. But regardless of what type of camera you're using, what I recommend doing instead of using Adobe Color is to come up here and to click on this let me go back because I probably did that quickly. Click on this little square icon here. And then in here, in this dropdown, you will see a dropdown for camera matching. These are custom color profiles created by Adobe that match the picture styles that are built into your particular camera. For example, standard always seems to work really well for me, especially with landscape images, anything that has, nice like yellows and oranges and the highlights like this. Oh, and by the way, one of the things that you can do, if you go into the preferences of Lightroom, let me just open that up really quick. Go to the presets tab, and then here you will see raw defaults. And the initial value here will be Adobe default. What you can do is change this over to camera settings. And what will then happen is that whenever you import RAW files from your camera, the baseline camera matching profile for that camera will be applied to it automatically instead of using Adobe Color. Okay, my next recommendation after you have made a decision about your color profile, when you begin a RAW edit, the next thing that I would do is just kind of forget about color for a little bit. Just kind of, push color over here to the side. When you start adjusting the tonality of your image, when you start adjusting exposure, your contrast, you are also affecting color. Specifically, you are affecting the saturation of color. This is why a lot of times when you start increasing the contrast of an image, or especially that dehaze tool in Lightroom, if you start pushing that thing up, the colors in your image they oftentimes can get kind of muddy. Like blue skies can get like really dark blue. Oranges and reds start getting oversaturated. So it's better, I think, to make decisions about the tonality and contrast of an image without involving color. Unfortunately, in Lightroom, that is really simple and easy to do. All you have to do is come up here to the treatment row at the beginning or at the very top of the develop panel and change this from color to black and white. Now, just to clarify, we are not creating a black and white image here. All we are doing is just temporarily disabling color in the image so that we can focus on the tonality. I can come in here and make adjustments to the highlights in the image. I can adjust the whites, maybe pull up the blacks a little bit or the shadows in order to pull out some additional detail there. But all I'm really trying to do here is just create a better baseline, just kind of normalize some of the tonal values. And then when you're done with that and you feel like you're in a good place, all you have to do is come back up here to treatment and then click on color, and then the color returns to the image. And I have found this to be just a good way to kind of trick your eye, because then you're not being fooled by color. You're not allowing color to influence your decisions in any way. And it's a very effective technique I have found. So definitely give that a try. All right, so my next color tip is about the next row down in the develop panel, which is white balance. White balance is a rather deceptively simple tool. And the reason I say that is because when I first got it, I speak with experience, because when I first got into, photography a number of years ago, I was under the impression at first that, white balance was, something that had to be corrected, that it always had to be corrected. And truth be told, I made many of my images worse. So let's jump back into Lightroom here, and I'm going to show you an example. Okay, so this is a raw image here that was captured in Iceland, in the highlands of Iceland a few years ago. And you will notice over here that I have my white balance currently set to as shot. This is actually the correct white balance of the image, because this image was taken like around midnight in summer when, Iceland has its midnight sun where it never gets completely dark. It actually just kind of gets a little bit dim, like a 40-watt bulb, like between, like 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. somewhere in there. And at that time of day, there's all this blue atmospheric light that is bouncing off of the stratosphere and is casting this blue color cast all over the volcanic rock here in the foreground. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is me from years ago, and I'm looking at this image and I'm thinking, yeah, this image is totally wrong. It has too much color cast in it. There's too much blue. I should correct the color cast. Well, obviously we could do that by coming up here and grabbing the eyedropper. Find something white or neutral or gray in the image, and this is probably the best thing. I can just click on the hood of the car here, and now the paint on the Land Rover is pure white. Like, it is, spectrally neutral. But now if we back out and take a look at the image, well, now we have a completely different image. I mean, other areas of the image that are neutral, like the snow and the cloudy overcast sky up here, those are now neutral as well. And the moss on the hills up here are also that kind of yellowy green that you see in Iceland. So this is a technically corrected image. Like, I have corrected the white balance in the image in order to make all of the neutrals spectrally neutral. But what I have also done here is change the light. I've changed the light in the image to make it appear as if this image was taken midday. Now it looks like it was taken on a warm, overcast day in the middle of the afternoon, because in the middle of the afternoon, the color temperature of the sun is like around 5,600 Kelvin. So it looks now like midday, which is nothing like what the actual experience of being there was like. It's correct, but now it has no character. Like, there's no longer any story with the image. Now, some of you may look at this and think that, the corrected version looks better. And if you do, that's totally cool. Like, everyone has, color is a highly subjective thing. Everyone has a different opinion. My opinion is that the image loses something by being, corrected in a technical manner like this. The better white balance for the photo is one that faithfully and authentically represents the color temperature of light when the photo was actually taken. So in summary here, my recommendation to you, when you sit down and edit a raw image and you undoubtedly start messing around with the color temperature and tint slider up there, just pause for a moment and just think about what your intent with the image is. What is your goal? Where is it that you're trying to get to? Are you trying to create a photograph that is a facsimile of reality that has faithful and accurate color in it? Well, if so, then use the eyedropper and pick something neutral and try to remove all color cast from the photo. If you are trying to just simply enhance and support the natural, authentic light that's in the image, then use color temperature and tint in order to do that. Or if you're trying to tell a story or convey a particular mood or a particular look, then use color temperature and tint creatively. Just forget about the technical nature of it and just use it as a creative color tool. Okay, for my next color tip, I want to demonstrate for you the practical use of one of the most mysterious, and I would imagine probably one of the most confusing panels that is available in Adobe Lightroom Classic. I don't believe this is available in the cloud version of Lightroom, unfortunately. I think this is a Classic only thing. Some of you may already know exactly what I'm talking about, and that panel is the calibration panel. I actually use the calibration panel so much that I moved it from the bottom of the develop view all the way up to the top, because I like to use it at the beginning of an edit. We're going to edit an image here, and I'm going to show you like a creative use for it. But let's begin with the technical, and let's take a look at what it is that this panel actually does, in case you don't, totally understand it. Every single pixel that you see on screen has red, green, and blue in it. Even like a pure red pixel has green and blue. It may be 0% green and 0% blue, but green and blue are still part of the equation, are still part of the recipe of that color. And that red, green, and blue recipe is part of every single color, every single pixel that you see on screen. So what's interesting about the calibration panel is that it is a global color editing tool that changes the recipe of each pixel. It moves the red, green, and blue percentages, like the quantity of red, green, and blue in each pixel. It moves it around to create other colors. So if we begin with red primary here and just push this all the way to the right, you'll see that not only is the color of red changing to more of an orange color, but all of the other colors in the color wheel are changing as well, because we're changing the percentage of red that is within each color. Same thing happens if we go in the opposite direction. If we go further towards magenta, red turns more magenta, but the other colors change as well. And you can especially see it when you're just ramping this back and forth quickly. Now the same thing happens with the other primaries. This is green, pushing this more towards green, which creates more of a pastel kind of a look. And if you go the opposite direction, well, the colors begin to get a little bit warmer, with green pushed more towards yellow. And then with blue, if we push this towards cyan, this is the crazy one. Blue primary always just seems to do some pretty wild things. Obviously, it's having a very pronounced effect on the blue, but it's really like saturating and really changing the other colors when blue primary is pushed towards cyan. And if we go in the opposite direction, then if we push blue further towards purple, then we get purple, then we get purple for the blues, and then everything else changes as well. Okay, so we're going to tone this image using the calibration panel. Now, what I recommend doing, this is at least what works for me, is to come up here and to just crank up these primary channels. Just, push red primary all the way to the right, push it all the way to the left, and just kind of get a sense for which direction feels right. Like which direction is the direction in which, you're trying to get to creatively with the image. For me, neither one of these directions really appeals to me. I don't particularly care for what red primary is doing. So let's try green, and we're going to crank this one all the way up. This direction to the right looks nice to me because the sky is turning more cyan. That side light is turning a little more red. And with the calibration panel, a little goes a long way. So I could just turn this up just right about there, just to give a little bit of red to that highlight and to change the blue sky to being a little more cyan. Now, if I wanted to emphasize this, I could just turn up the saturation some right about there for now. I think that looks pretty good. So now let's take a look at blue. Now, as I said earlier, blue primary is a little unwieldy, a little crazy. If we go all the way to the right, well, we get this crazy purple sky. If we go to the left is actually pretty good. Pushing this more towards cyan, we're again getting more cyan in the sky, a little more red, a little more magenta in the highlights, which is actually pretty nice. So let's bring this back to 0, and I'm going to push blue primary a little bit to the left. Again, a little goes a long way. You don't need much. And let me just toggle this panel on and off and see the difference. We've made just a big difference. Actually, let's back out and look at it. That is without the custom or the calibration panel, and that is with. And you can see just how much richer the colors are now looking, how much more depth and character we're giving to the image just by manipulating these calibration sliders. Okay, my next tip, and actually the next couple of tips, are about the global saturation slider. This is a slider that you see up here at the top of the develop panel in this presence box here. You might look at this and think, oh, this needs saturation because the colors look a little flat, they look a little dim, which they do. So your instinct may be to come over here to saturation and just start turning up saturation. Notice what's happening to the greens and even like this red and the flag here, and everything is starting to look like almost fluorescent. And the reason the results end up looking so bad is because in digital photography, when you increase the saturation of something, you are also affecting its brightness. The more saturation you inject, the brighter that color becomes. So that's why the greens in this image just suddenly start looking fluorescent and they start glowing, because we're also increasing their luminance when we're adding saturation to them. Unlike the slider that is directly above it, which is vibrance. So if we just take all of that saturation out and use vibrance instead, you'll see that we are adding saturation to the image, but it looks more natural. Vibrance is more selective with how it adds saturation. It only increases the saturation of areas that are missing saturation, that are low in saturation, and it avoids areas that are already saturated, like this, like this flag over here. So essentially, it is balancing out the saturation in the image by bringing up the undersaturated areas to be more aligned with the areas that are already saturated to balance color. So next tip with the global saturation slider, and this is something that I frequently do that helps me out quite a lot, and maybe this will help you as well. Every now and then, like I'll come across a raw image, like this one here, and I'll be looking at it, and I can't quite figure out like what's wrong with the color. Like something about it is bothering me, but I can't quite figure out what it is. Well, something you could do with saturation, and this is similar to like, listening to music, and you turn up the volume in order to, hear and isolate, like the different instruments. Well, you can crank up the global saturation slider all the way up. Just crank it all the way up to 100. And then when you do that, you're able to see everything that is going on with every single pixel in the image. You're able to see all of those colors. And so now I can see when looking at this image that there is like kind of an odd, like a blue and purple color cast going on down here in these darker areas of the image. And there might be like a little too much cyan back here in the background as well. Like I could push the yellow a little more towards orange, maybe reduce the saturation of the blues and the aqua tones in the image. And there you can see like I'm already pulling some of that out. And so that is like a really nice way to just turn up the volume of the song, in order to, better hear what's going on in, all the different areas. Okay, my next color tip is to use negative luminance to add saturation and depth to your images. This technique is more similar to how color mixing behaves in the real world, like in film and painting. And when you add more color to a color, typically that color gets darker because film and everything else is a subtractive color mixing environment, whereas digital is additive, where you add more color, that color gets closer towards white. It gets brighter on a screen, whereas in film and paint and everything else, the more colors you mix together, the darker they get. So we can emulate the behavior of film here by pulling some of the brightness out of the image, which increases its depth and gives the appearance of additional saturation. So if I pull down the luminance slider of the greens here, not only am I affecting their exposure, like I'm bringing them down, I'm making them a little bit darker, but that's also increasing the depth of the greens. It's also making them look a little bit deeper and gives the appearance of additional saturation, which if I just toggle this on and off, you can see that now we're getting more green, but we're adding more green in a subtractive way. We're not doing it in an additive way by injecting more saturation and making them brighter. We're actually adding saturation and increasing depth by making them darker. Now, if this isn't quite rich enough for you, you can just pull the luminance down a little bit and then maybe tick up your green just a little bit, just to add some saturation into that place, into that particular area, maybe a little in the yellows as well. And now you can see the difference. So yeah, very effective technique for very like natural and authentic way of adding saturation by using negative luminance. All right, my next color tip is to reduce the complexity of color in your raw images. And I think this image here is a really good example because there is a lot of color going on in this photo. I mean, we have, these blues, these dark blues, orange and yellow and green, and maybe even some blue as well. The thing with color is that the more colors that are present in an image, the more complex the image becomes, the more things there are for the viewer to be distracted by. And what happens when when an image contains a lot of color and a lot of distraction, well, the eye typically doesn't go where you want it to go. Like it's not as focused on your primary subject, like the thing you want the viewer to look at, because it's, the eye kind of ping pongs all over the place because there's just this cornucopia of color in the image. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes that is actually like the intent of the image and the purpose of the image. You want to show the variety of color in the photo. And I think you could probably make a fair argument that that's kind of the point of this one. It's nice seeing this, multi-layered landscape with this rich variety of color in it. But let's say, just for the sake of argument, that that's not what you want. Like, you want to purify the image, you want to simplify it, you kind of want to tone it down a little bit, make it a little bit quieter so it's not quite as loud, so that your subject stands out a little bit more. Well, to do that, what you do is come down here to the HSL panel. And what you want to do here is you want to bend neighboring hues together. Figure out what you want your target hue to be, and then anything that's near it, just bend those hues in the direction of that target hue. So let's say, for example, with this one here, let's say that I want to calm down all of this grass here and just focus on making everything more green. Well, the first thing that I would do is just make green more green. Like, I come over here to green, and I could push this further in that direction. And then with the yellow slider above it, I'm going to push that further towards green so that now the yellows are bending more in that direction. Orange, and bend that further towards yellow, which then in turn bends it further towards green. So now you can see that we've created a more uniform appearance in the landscape here. Like, now, to my eyes at least, the gate sticks out more than it did before, because I'm no longer distracted by all these competing colors in the image and all these other things that were distracting my eye before. So this technique really is all about simplification. It's all about creating a stronger, more purposeful image by subtracting distracting things from the image, by removing distracting colors from the image, but without desaturating those images. We are maintaining their saturation. We are keeping the colors. We're just bending them closer towards other ones to create a more uniform, more intentful image. Okay, my next color tip is to mix complementary colors to desaturate and lower the vibrancy and lower the intensity of colors in your image. When you are working with color, anytime you have one color, and if you mix the color, mix into it the color that is directly opposite on the color wheel, say you have blue, if you were to take yellow and mix it in with blue, well, that blue would then be pushed further towards neutral. So let's say, for example, just for the sake of argument, that you want to pull out some of this deep blue and purple here in the foreground. Like, that's just not working for you. Well, what you can do is just come over here to color grading, go to shadows, and take a look at the wheel and see what is directly across. Well, that would be right up around here between yellow and green on the wheel. So we just put this over to here and then start turning up the saturation and watch what happens to the purple in the foreground. It's getting closer to black. It's getting closer towards just neutral gray. And if we crank up the saturation all the way, well, then some of that greenish yellow color starts to get in there. It's not quite right. But if I just fine tune this a little bit, let me see if I can find the exact complement. I think that looks about right. So now we have, just with that one, adjustment, just by adding some of this yellowy green into this area, or into these colors rather, in the shadows, we have effectively removed all of that purple blue tone. So again, this is a technique you can utilize a variety of different ways. And I think once you get it in your head and you just remember that, that the complement of a color will always desaturate it and bring it closer towards neutral, well, then you can use it, for all kinds of things. You could use it to, bring down some of the color in your highlights. You could use it to remove color casts from the midtones of your image or the shadows, whatever it may be. Just mix in the complement of whatever it is that you're seeing on screen, and that will push that color further towards neutral. So remember back at the beginning of this video when I said that in digital photography, when you add contrast to an image, you are indirectly affecting color, how colors can become more saturated, and so it's better to, work in black and white and then go back to color. Well, Adobe recently added something really interesting to to Adobe Lightroom in order to counteract some of those changes to color that can happen when you are increasing contrast or when you're adjusting contrast in general. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of you haven't even noticed this addition, because it is really, really small. Okay, so I'm going to come over here to the tone curve panel, and I'm going to assign a classic S curve like so. I'm sure you've probably done this 1,000 times in order to increase the contrast of the image. And as you can see, it takes very little effort to completely destroy the colors in the image. I mean, they look terrible. Like everything is really muddy and dense, and because of that tone curve, because of the increase in contrast that we applied. Well, what's interesting is that in newer versions of Lightroom, we now have this refined saturation tool here. And what we can do is bring this to the left. And when we do, we reduce that increase in saturation that was caused by applying that S curve. We can actually take this all the way down to 0 if we want to. And let me just delete these control points, and because then I think it'll be clearer to see. If we now add an S curve, and this is with refined saturation all the way down at 0, you can see that we are increasing the luminance of these regions, like let's say the midtones. So I'm increasing the luminance of the midtones here, but I'm not changing their color. I'm not injecting more color, more saturation into that area. I'm just affecting the luminance. Sometimes the effect looks a little bit weird, in my opinion. Sometimes it just doesn't look natural, and it's something for you to experiment with. So I recommend next time that you're in here and you're applying an adjustment and you're applying a tone curve or applying some kind of contrast curve to an image, play around with this refined saturation slider here and see if it produces better results for you. So I hope there was at least one tip in this video that helped you out, one tip that gave you a different way of thinking about color when you are editing your raw images in Adobe Lightroom. If there was, and if I succeeded in that goal, please take a moment and give this video a thumbs up down below. It would really help me out and expose more people to this video and help support this channel as well. And by the way, if you made it this far and you don't have Lightroom, I can't imagine that, but if you did, and you want to give Lightroom a try for yourself and you've never used it, there's a link down below in the video description you may use to download it from Adobe, so you can be doing all the same things that I've been doing here. Greatly appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.